Hey everybody, this is Jeff with MERIDIAN BIOSOLUTIONS. Just really launching our webinar series that's going to be posted here on YouTube. And the first item I wanted to address, and I promise this is going to be a very short presentation, but a question I get asked a lot surrounds the regulatory environment in biomedicine and regenerative medicine. Admittedly, it's very complex, okay? But what I want to do today is really simplify that for you and let you know how things are truly regulated, what some of these strange definitions truly mean, and potentially how they might impact you. As an owner of a company that is marketing and commercializing regenerative medicine products, my utmost priority is to be in compliance, and the laboratories we've chosen to work with are all above board. They all have very tight relationships with the FDA, and as we move through this, you'll see really what I call the pillars of this 361 designation for regulating these type of components. So first of all, let's make a definition. What are HTCTPs? Okay, these are articles, and again, this is strictly from, and I'm going to put a link to this document in the video here, but this is from the FDA. This is their own guidance, so I'm quoting directly from them. Articles containing or consisting of human cells or tissues that are intended for implantation, transplantation, infusion, or transfer into a human recipient. So these can be really any type of tissue. The most common, you're going to see bone, skin, placental tissues, the amniotic membranes, umbilical cords, adipose, cartilage, tendons, ligaments. Those are all very commonly used in this space, and those are really what we're going to be focused on today when we talk about HTCTPs. So how are they regulated? The FDA calls this a tiered risk-based approach. Okay, so the FDA is a lot of gray area, and I am not an expert on the FDA by any means. They do some really good things, and they do some other things that they fall into this gray area that are very subjective. But the FDA does have the authorization given to it by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic and the Health Service Acts, so they can regulate these products as drugs, devices, or in fact biologics. And what they did is they said, for us to be able to do that, we need to give clear criterion on how we are going to go about that. Okay, so if something should fall within this group of guidelines, then they can be regulated under 361, okay, of the PHS Act. If they don't, if they can't prove, if a manufacturer cannot prove that they fall into those guidelines, then they must be regulated either as a drug, which moves into a 351 pathway, which is a very arduous process, a very expensive, time-consuming. That's the same pathway where all of your pharmaceuticals must go so they can get approval, okay? If it's regulated as a device, it can go through various 510K pathways, for example. But the key there is if it doesn't meet these criteria, and we're going to get into it in the next slide, then it cannot be regulated as a 361. So what are the four pillars of HTCTP regulation? The first one is minimal manipulation, okay, and we're going to get into all these. How you process the tissue matters, especially with respect to how it performs in the recipient versus how it would perform in nature in the donor, okay? The second one is homologous use. And that one is a little more difficult to define. We're going to get into that a little bit, okay? But basically, homologous use means it must have in the recipient at least one or more of the basic functions as it does in the donor, okay? And there's also a lot of labeling and advertising considerations that go along with this pillar as well. The third, you cannot combine your tissue with other tissues, okay? Outside of adding various crystalloids or cryopreservation compounds or components that enhance sterilization. Okay, those generally are going to be okay, but you cannot take a structural tissue and then add some cells to it and call it a new product. That's outside the bounds of what will allow you to get that 361 designation. And then finally, your product cannot have a systemic effect, and you cannot rely on the metabolic activity for its primary function. Okay? So that's a big one. But again, these last two are pretty self-explanatory. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. In fact, I'm going to spend 0 time on those. But they are there. And laboratories that are formulating these products, they need to be concerned with those last two. Okay? And the laboratories I choose to work with, I make sure that they have ongoing relationships with the FDA, mock inspections on at least a quarterly basis, to make sure that everything's above board. And a lot of that pertains to pillars 3 and 4 here, but also if there's any change in processing, making sure those changes also fit the definition of minimal manipulation. So let's start there. What is minimal manipulation? And again, this is coming directly from the FDA guideline that I'll post in the link here below the video. But the processing of the HTCTP does not alter the original relevant characteristics of the tissue relating to that tissue's utility for reconstruction, repair, or replacement. So basically what this is saying, it's pretty self-evident. I think that's worded fairly clearly. You cannot harvest a structural tissue. Let's say it's a ligament or a tendon, right? You cannot subject that tissue from the donor through a process that changes its ability to function as in the manner that it would have functioned in the donor. Okay? So however you choose to process the tissue, it cannot alter the eventual function of that tissue, even if that tissue, let's say like a tendon's going to be a structural tissue, right? Even if that structural tissue is placed in another body compartment, the processing of that tissue cannot change inherently its ability to be a structural component. All right? So I mentioned structural tissues. So when it comes to minimal manipulation, the FDA considers structural and non-structural tissues. For what I do and for what most folks do, it falls into the class or in the class of structural tissues. Non-structural tissues are going to be your various cells and tissues, maybe whether it's liver cells or what have you, parathyroid cells that don't really have structural functions. They have more biologic or metabolic type functions. So if you look at what are structural tissues, they're tissues that support or serve as a barrier or conduit to connect, cover, or cushion in the donor and are generally considered structural tissues. Bone, skin, we talked about these earlier. Those are largely structural tissues. What is minimal manipulation of structural tissues? We already kind of went over this. The processing does not alter the original relevant characteristics of the tissue relating to the tissue's ability for reconstruction, repair, or replacement. All right, so we've kind of talked about that already. What are non-structural tissues? I kind of explained this. HTCTPs that serve metabolic or other biochemical roles in the body such as hematopoietic, immune, and endocrine functions. So reproductive cells, tissues, stem cell progenitor cells, lymph tissue, thymus, pancreatic tissues, things like that are what we consider non-structural tissues. So minimal manipulation of these is the process. The processing must not alter the biological characteristics, okay, or the biochemical characteristics of that tissue. So it's very analogous to what you see with structural tissues. So, and it's all relative to the donor, not to the recipient. Okay, so it must perform biologically and biochemically in the same capacity after processing in the recipient as it did in the donor prior to processing. Okay, so that's minimal manipulation in a nutshell. It's not that difficult to understand. Largely, when I talk to my laboratories that I work with, I kind of leave that to them. I mean, I understand how they process it. A lot of it is proprietary, so it's difficult for me to get an absolute clear vision of every single processing step. But the FDA is shown that information, and they make those determinations whether, okay, that is minimally processed or it is not. Okay, so if you look at the landscape recently, several large companies are now just done in this space because their processing it failed this minimal manipulation test. So this is a very important litmus test for whether your product is going to be regulated as a 361 versus a drug or a device. So let's move on to a little more complex, what I consider a little more complex, that is homologous use. So homologous use, and again I'm going to use the FDA definition, homologous use means the repair, reconstruction, replacement, or supplementation of a recipient's cells or tissues with an HTTP that performs the same basic function or functions in the recipient as in the donor. Okay? So what does that mean? It means that the recipient cells or the recipient, okay, the cells that are transferred to the recipient must perform, and I shouldn't say cells or tissues. Let's use the word tissues. The tissue must perform one or more of the same basic functions in the recipient as they perform in the donor. Okay? So if you take a tissue that performs differently in the recipient than it does in the donor, and it only needs to perform in one way. Okay, so this is a very subjective determination, this homologous use clause. And again, this is where you trust your laboratories. And this is why it's so important to find partners, whether they're your distributors or if you're working with laboratories directly, to get them to explain these situations for all of their products. Why is your product homologous? What does it mean? What is your argument for that? It's very important. And if a lab won't answer that question for you, or if a sales representative will not answer that question for you, it's probably time to move on until you get that information. Okay? Now, does the tissue have to be used in the same anatomic location? No, it does not. As long as that tissue is performing at least one of the basic functions of that tissue in the donor in the recipient. Okay? All right, now here's probably the most complicated, and this is what I deal with every day. And if you're a physician listening to this, or a practitioner, I should say, this is important. Advertising, labeling, citing indications, very treacherous ground to tread here. The FDA has spent a lot of time chasing laboratories over the last 3 or 4 years, and they've weeded a lot of them out. because they made mistakes. They made claims. They designated indications for use of certain products that really, based on the 361, you can't make those type of claims or judgments about your product. But what I see, I spend a lot of time scouring through physician websites who are working in the biomedicine space, and I'd say 9 out of 10 of them are out of compliance with this. And the FDA is going to come after you. It's time to button this up. Okay? What you have on the website, especially your website, or, worse yet, social media, putting any type of inferences to improve patient outcomes, inferences to indications. For example, if you said, hey, I provide Wharton's jelly injections to solve or to address knee and hip arthritis, that's a huge violation. You can't do that. So tighten this up, make 0 claims. You cannot make any claims. If you look at my website, you look at my YouTube videos, they're so bland and generic and vanilla because I can't say anything. Okay? Making claims accidentally, even inadvertent claims that you think are fine, that you think are very neutral, can come back to haunt you. So be very, very careful. If you're a practitioner with any sort of digital presence, please get together with your marketing people and move through that copy and make sure that it is clean. If not, at some point it's going to happen. You're going to get a nice letter from the FDA saying you've got 30 days to cease and desist, right? And those aren't fun. That doesn't mean you're in trouble necessarily, but you're going to be out of the regenerative medicine business once that happens. So make no claims, and especially do not express any indications for this on your website. Okay? If you have any questions, you can call me 630-716-2064. You can email me at jeff@meridianbiosolutions.com. I'll be happy to go through the copy on your website, talk to your marketing department at no cost. Okay? Because it's good for the industry if we all are working by the FDA's rules. That's good for the industry. Okay? Something else I can help you with. Go to the website, stayregenerative.com, sign up, just give me your email address, and I'm going to send you 38 things you cannot say on your website if you have a biomedicine and or regenerative medicine practice. Okay? That'll be helpful. That's a great place to start. Thank you so much for listening. I hope this was reasonably helpful. Please leave some comments. And I need followers, man. So click that subscribe button. We're going to be putting a lot of new content up here. A lot of different webinars we'll be doing. I'm doing some additional videos as well. So please stay tuned. We'll talk to you soon. Stay regenerative. Peace.